This is the laptop I'll toggle on, right?
Yep, this is your.
Very good.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
welcome.
Well, good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm delighted to begin into lecture 3. We're going to finish off dynamic capabilities and related paradigms. That'll be done, I believe, before the break. We take a short break. After the break, I will talk a little bit about the midterm and the final, and then launch into intangible assets. A little bit of catching up to do, but that's okay. We'll manage to catch up. So we were left with a few questions that we didn't get to last time. So just to get you warmed up a little bit, one of you asked, are Quibi and Magic Leap examples of uncertain imitability? Well, first of all, let's just remember what uncertain imitability is. It's this idea that sometimes things are hard to copy because you don't actually know what the key ingredients are of what you're copying. So let's go back to the 80s when we're trying to figure out the Japanese system of production. The Japanese productivity was very high, and people thought, well, maybe the reason is because they do calisthenics at lunchtime. What is the foundation for success? Well, in the end, it took a long time to figure it out, and it had to do with micro innovation on the shop floor. So particularly if it's an organizational matter and you see someone being successful, it's not a straightforward job to figure out how to mimic what they're doing, because you don't necessarily know what the key elements of success are. So you need a causal model of some kind. So that's what uncertain imitability is about. It's not as straightforward. Imitability is not as straightforward as you may think, particularly if it's at the organizational level. So from what I understand, Quibi and Magic Leap, they were not stories of uncertain imitability. They were stories about innovation through new combinations, and their failure was fundamentally because of unsustainable business models. Perhaps they were unsustainable at the time, may eventually be sustainable, but I don't see that uncertain imitability was one of the key factors there, although I may have missed some aspect of the question that was put. If so, you can put the question to us again. Let's also move a little bit back to this topic of sensing. And remember, somebody asked for some authority about the Elko steam locomotive company and why they couldn't see the future. And I was able to dig up a quote here from 1938. The CEO of Elko, or the president, says, for a century, so that takes you to 2038. For a century, steam has been the principal railroad. No, sorry, he's looking backwards. Steam has been the principal railroad motive power. So backwards, it had been there for a century. But there's another quote where they said it'll be there through to the year 2000. But within 25 years of making that announcement, steam was almost eliminated, at least from the U.S. It was still continued in India and China at the time, but now in China it's pretty much gone, and I suspect it's pretty much gone in India too. There's a few mountain railroads that use steam. There's a few sugarcane fields in Fiji that use steam, but it was first the diesel and then the diesel electric that displaced steam. So, we shouldn't be surprised. Forecasting is a hazardous business. And in a world of deep uncertainty, one shouldn't try to forecast, but one should try and sense the future and be flexible and adaptive. That's the whole dynamic capability story. And it's particularly true in the knowledge economy. So what we're saying is, even in the industrial economy, what we're saying is true. There's deep uncertainty, and that's amplified in the knowledge economy. Now, where we left off last week was to compare dynamic capabilities with the, if you will, the bread and butter of strategy classes at Harvard and many other business schools. What I'm telling you here is I think those frameworks were misleading back in the 80s when they were first developed and presented. And if they were misleading back then, they're deeply mischievous today. And remember, the key aspect of Porter's framework was there were good industries and bad industries. And of course, you would want to be in a good industry, not in a bad industry. So it was a matter of seeking out opportunities where there was limited competition. In that sense, he got it right. I mean, strategy is always about trying to find a niche where there's limited competition. But he did the analysis at the industry level. And of course, that doesn't make any sense, because even if there are entry barriers into an industry, the question is, how much competition do you get within the industry? So anyway, this notion of finding sheltered industries didn't make any sense from the beginning. And it led to a view, and you actually heard GE articulate this view, is that the real asset to own is to be the largest guy in the market. This was Jack Welch at GE, so the GE, we only want to be number one or maybe number two. Complete nonsense, but that's what drove GE for a long time, and he managed to pump the share price up to make it look like his point was correct. But there were two independent events. Because what is a large market share? All it is vulnerability. So you don't look at market share, you look at capabilities. You look upstream from the market and you look at the capabilities of the firm, and you ask, if you got difficult to imitate dynamic capabilities and the ability to constantly seek out new opportunities. So it's a very, very different mental model. In the case of Porter, you look at the industry and you find good industries, and you shy away from bad industries, and you try and find high entry barriers and you shelter behind them. With dynamic capabilities, you don't really look at industries per se, you look at the environment. And you look at the capabilities of your competitors. There's nothing in Porter that looks at the capabilities of firms, either your own firm or the competitive firms. And dynamic capabilities is about focusing on building new capabilities as well as leveraging what you've got. And the long-term value model, the value creation model, is this evolutionary or ecological fitness. So what? Does it make a difference? That's what we'll come to in a moment. But just to remind you, this is the basic Porter model here. This is what the strategy analyst is supposed to do. Looks at an industry, looks at threats of new entrants. So it's not bereft of considering new entry, but it looks at threats and it looks at the entry barriers, and it basically says if there's high entry barriers, if you have to spend a lot of money to build plant and equipment, or if distribution's hard to get, or whatever it is, that's a good thing, so long as you're on the right side of the moat, so to speak. And you look at the bargaining power of suppliers, is there a competitive suppliers? If you're making running shoes, clearly you got 100 companies that'll make running shoes for you. If you're designing shirts, you got thousands of companies that'll make shirts for you. But if you're making laser guided earth leveling equipment, maybe there's just a few. So you look at threats from new entrants, you look at threats from substitutes on the consumer side. Are people going to discover they don't need my product, there's something else already out there that's going to become a substitute? And you look at all that sort of bargaining power upstream and downstream, and whether the industry is oligopolistic and so forth. Very standard textbook stuff from the industrial age. That's the basic model. You should be familiar with it, not because it's what you should use, But if you see somebody else using it and that informs their analysis, you know you've got a competitive advantage with respect to the analysis of the competitive circumstance. So let's apply that. How would you have felt if you'd done this analysis back in 2007? And remember, Nokia was the largest maker of handsets. They were top of the mountain, the leading supplier, you know, scores of factories around the world, fairly cost competitive, and fairly technologically savvy, nice products. You would have looked at the bargaining power of suppliers and you wouldn't be particularly worried because you were largely vertically integrated. You look at the bargaining power of buyers and, you know, there were individuals and there were the phone companies, you know, it was fairly fragmented, so, and global in nature, so not too much trouble there. If you looked at threats of new entrants, well, you know, there were true new cell phone companies popping up, but, you know, Motorola, Nokia had driven Motorola not out of the market, but into a diminutive position. Japanese companies like Sanyo and were in the market, so was Samsung. If you looked at threats of substitutes, well, it didn't look like there was much of a threat of a substitute because mobile phone was a mobile phone. You know, what was going to replace it? People weren't thinking wearables at that time, so weren't too many substitutes. So if you'd taken this Michael Porter's framework, you'd marched out with your Harvard MBA, you were advising the CEO of Nokia, you would have said it looks pretty good. Or if you were an investment analyst at Goldman Sachs sitting on the desk, you'd be, you know, you'd put a buy rating on Nokia. Yeah, so there I've just filled you in on the you know, the kind of data that you would collect if you did the Porter type analysis, and you would have given Nokia, you know, high marks, and you would have felt comfortable. If you had a dynamic capabilities framework, and the dynamic capabilities framework was out there in 2007, what would you have done? And what would you have seen, should I say? I think you would have been much more worried. First of all, with dynamic capabilities, you're always worried. There's no such thing as a good industry. Only the paranoid survive. So you never take comfort because while there are predictable improvements in chips and wireless, there's also, you know, at this time, you know, you've got the internet coming along, and you know, you've got to be thinking about how the internet is going to change the role of the mobile phone. That mobile devices are going to be useful not just for voice, but for data and all the kinds of things you can do with data. So I think dynamic capabilities would, A, you wouldn't rest comfortable. Two, you'd be thinking about the new opportunities of combining technologies, and you might be at least open to the notion that, you know, you were putting a phone into a computer rather than a computer into the phone, which of course is what Apple did. And at the same time, you'd be thinking about the need to transform. So I think if you rigorously went through a sensing analysis, you would look beyond the industry. And Apple, remember, Apple at the time was not in the phone business, so you'd be looking outside the industry. Secondly, you would be recognizing that the internet was going to allow all kinds of different services, and that you know, 3G, I think in 2007, 3G was rolled out, but 4G was coming, and it was known that 4G was coming. You'd be looking at what does 4G mean? And Porter's industry model wouldn't have necessarily taken you there, at least not as readily. And it would make you realize that you maybe got the wrong capabilities. You got this whole vertically integrated system. Now, maybe you can say, well, Professor Teece, this is Monday morning quarterbacking. It's all very well and good to say that now. But I think, go back and do the exercise yourself and close your mind off to what you know. It's hard to do, but you can do it. And I think you would come up with something like this. One of the other aspects that Nokia has to deal with, of course, is that even if it recognizes these changes are coming, in some sense, they've got to re-engineer their whole company, whereas Apple doesn't. It's creating a new business. So to put this in real time, there were senior Nokia executives came to Berkeley in 2007, 2006, 2007, and asked me to speak about dynamic capabilities. And I told them I thought they had a problem. I didn't know about the Apple iPhone. I said, amongst other things, you've got 40 to 50 manufacturing plants around the world. And whatever's coming next, you've got all of this embedded investment that is going to be rendered redundant or it's going to have to change. And I could just imagine executive meetings where you have representatives from these companies with thousands of employees showing up around the table, and they're focused on keeping high utilization in the plants. So they want you to keep making stuff that's pretty much the same today as you made yesterday with improvements. So you've got all the weight, all the baggage of the fact that you're the market leader. I did say that before I knew anything about what would happen, and dynamic capabilities would let you understand that you're no longer nimble once you're a market leader. Well, at least you have to work hard to stay nimble when you're the market leader, just like Apple has to work hard to stay nimble as a market leader today. So definitely you get a different perspective. I'm not saying you would have predicted exactly what happened, but it is remarkable to me. And you may remember the famous quote by Steve Ellop, who was put in as the CEO of Nokia, and he was asked to look back on the circumstances. This is line 210 or thereabouts. He says, we weren't beaten by a better phone. We were beaten by an ecosystem. So really it was a change in the business model. It wasn't the technological hurdles. It was the business model hurdles. It was the organizational, their limited ability to see that there was an ecosystem that was necessary to support, the use of the phone as an internet access device. So, they certainly admitted later that they had misdiagnosed the situation in a major way. It was not about competing device to device, but competing ecosystem to ecosystem. So we use this to underscore the fact that capabilities-driven strategies are different from sort of Porter-esque market-driven strategies. First of all, we don't believe you have to be the first mover, and we don't believe, as Jack Welch once believed, Jack Welch has now passed away, that the goal is to be number one in the market. The goal is to find a place where in the market where you can, through innovation, continue to stay ahead of the competition, and you keep addressing new markets and new opportunities ahead of the competition, and that you're constantly learning. And it's about owning the ability to learn, owning the intangibles, and learning by doing, learning by using, learning by experimentation, and so forth. That's the orientation you get from a capabilities perspective. And I think wise leaders and to run a big company or a little company today, it's this ability to integrate these different perspectives and understandings of the technology and the marketplace and so forth, that is critical. So here's 5 hallmarks of a wise leader. If I borrow the term of not created, but used by my friend Jiro Nanaka at Hida Sabasi, and he has a paper in the Harvard Business Review about the wise leader. For me, in the dynamic capabilities world, a wise leader allows risk-taking, and not necessarily very much in favor of diversification, only if it's closely related and coherent. So it's also, a lot of it's about what you say no to, and Steve Jobs was very, very loud and clear on that. It wasn't what you say yes to as much as what you want to say no to when you have deep uncertainty, because there's always 100 rabbit holes to go down if the world is rich with opportunities. So, you focus, you favor capability building, you say no more often than you say yes, and you take the long view. That's the hallmarks of the wise leader. And I'd say you take a multi-stakeholder perspective as well. Didn't put that up there, but on the next version of the slide, I will. Also, and this is getting close to where we're going for most of today, it's not the tangible assets that matter anymore. It's the intangible assets. And capabilities are a form of intangibles. Of course, they don't show up on the balance sheet. And the reason for that is intangibles are more elusive. Believe it or not, while they're difficult to own, if you've actually got them effectively in your control, they're difficult for other people to imitate. You can't just buy them by writing a check. The physical assets are just table stakes to win at the competitive arena. It's the intangibles that are the most critical. So that's laying the foundation for where we're going here. And as we said before, take the long view. So prioritize intangibles, take the long view, be wary of diversification. Is really interesting. You think about Apple and all the cash they have and the fact that they could have gone on a spending spree without any trouble whatsoever. To their credit, they have not. They sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out on autonomous cars. Looks like it's 1 foot back in, but being very careful not to diversify too far. And any diversification they do is related to using the existing resources that they have. And frequently that resource is data and big data. So stay focused. It's not to say you don't diversify, but you do coherent diversification. And that may be in the home market, or it can be geographical. And in some cases, you have to, and there's great opportunities from geographical expansion too. And close in is not necessarily defined by distance, it's defined by similarities amongst the markets and the rule of law and issues of that kind. So this is a bit of a summary slide. Remember, we ended the last lecture by talking about the role of strategy. And dynamic capabilities have to, which is getting the sensing, seizing, and transformation part right. They have to be informed. Getting that right means you have to be informed by good strategic analysis along the way. I don't apologize for the fact that this is complicated. If you want something easy, just go use the Porter framework. It's wrong, but it's easy. Take your pick. Or if you got something better that's neither Porter nor dynamic capabilities, I've got my ears open. So here's a concluding proposition this is all top level. Strong dynamic capabilities coupled with a valid strategy enable organizations to change in a manner that supports evolutionary fitness and sustainable long-term competitive advantage. And, sustainable long-term competitive advantage, that is where you've got something that's valuable, that's hard for others to imitate, so you can get superior margins on the bottom line, and you can take those margins and you can keep investing and continuing to innovate and stay ahead of the competition. So that's I'm now giving you the dynamic capabilities framework. So why doesn't the class end now? Because I'm just giving you a superficial overview. I've now got to, maybe I'm lucky and I've convinced you it's correct. I wouldn't expect that, but if I'm lucky and you're convinced, that's great. But I find for people to really be convinced about something, they've really got to understand the foundations, and then they're able to play with the model and play with the framework and get more facile with it. So what the rest of the class is about is doing exactly that. And as I said in day one, dynamic capabilities really pulls together a lot of ideas in business and a lot of knowledge from business history, and so exploring those foundations is, I think, a useful job. By the way, here's the latest version of Dynamic Capabilities published in Japanese. That's my second book in Japanese. Japanese are going crazy about this stuff because they know that this is something they come up short on. They, like Europe, they don't know big tech firms in Japan. Why? I think the Japanese were really good in the industrial economy. They took the industrial economy model to the nth degree of perfection, and that's great if the industrial model and the industrial economy is still around, but the industrial economy is substantially gone. Now we're in the knowledge economy, and so they're beautifully positioned for yesterday's world. And not to say the U.S. is well positioned, or U.S. firms are well positioned everywhere either, but at least we've moved into the knowledge age. So let me, this is the beginning of the backup now. Now, you remember the first item on the reading list is this paper on next generation competition. So the world of ordinary capabilities is last generation's competition. The world of Michael Porter in the Harvard Business School is the last generation. And that's what I'm represented here by conventional concepts. Competition static, most of the technology belongs in the West. Not much attention given to China, when China is clearly a leader today, as is India, at least on software. Focus is on industry level analysis. Vertical integration is the norm. If the governance problems you worry about are transactions cost and principal agent problems and managerial malfeasance. And when you do think about innovation, you think about what I call one product, one invention, that the name of the game is to come up with an invention and embed it in a product. Well, what I call here next generation, which is the knowledge economy, where we've been at least since the year 2000. Let's start at the top. It's no longer static competition, which is price competition driven by a bunch of folks with the same technology competing against each other to squeeze a few pennies out of the cost structure to get a market advantage. It's not GE making light bulbs and competing with Westinghouse. It's dynamic competition, which is the key driver of competition is innovation. The world's not fully globalized, but it's at least semi-globalized. And all of the innovation is not coming from the West. China and the new Asian economies are significant contributors. Thirdly, in today's world, It's no longer industry level analysis. I think a better concept is ecosystem analysis. Industries never made sense, in my view, because there are statistical artifacts. Ecosystems are not statistical artifacts, which makes it difficult to draw a line around them. But you have to understand ecosystems in order to understand how competition evolves. A biologist would naturally think in terms of ecosystems. Why not an economist? Vertical integration, yes, still important in some cases, but modularization is perhaps a more relevant concept, where you're going to have this module made. And if you modularize, do you really need to vertically integrate? We're not so much worried about transaction costs and agency costs. We're worried about, and we need to be worried about, firm level capabilities. And in terms of the innovation model, it's what I call the multi-invention model. And the iPhone has something like, 50 to 100,000 patents that are implicated by all the technologies pulled together. By the way, it's not anything new. If you go back to the sewing machine invented by Singer, there was 800, 900, maybe over 1,000 patents involved with the sewing machine. It's not that, we haven't been in a multi-invention world. It's that we've been thinking as if the world is one invention, one product. And until you understand that that's not so, you're not going to get your hands around the managerial challenge. So let me just go a little bit further and then we'll stop and ask for some questions. So this is the old economy. I thank my good friend Bill Lazonic for these diagrams. I just discovered them today, actually. But it is a good way to describe the old economy and how Japan did very well against the United States in the old economy, not today's economy. But in the US, we had execs and we had, middle management, which we call specialists, and we had hourly operatives underneath. And the Japanese, actually, it was a very male-oriented organizational structure where there was a very different role between male and female. But in some ways, it was the same model. But as you can see, in the case of Japan, there was much more connection and information flow up and down. Japanese decision-making was much more inclusive. It wasn't as hierarchical. It wasn't always fast at making decisions, but when decisions were made, execution was fast because there'd been a lot of talking and drinking of sake before any decision was made. And Japan, in some ways, outcompeted the United States in the old industrial model. And this is a little bit more of a comparison between the two. The old industrial model, strategy was growth by building internal capabilities. In the new model, it's not just about internal capabilities, it's also about external capabilities and the sale of branded components to systems integrators. So you have systems integrators, you have people, you have innovation inside, you have innovation outside. So what Lazonic is calling new economy model is exactly what I'm calling next generation. The strategy process in the old economy relied mainly on R&D labs. That's where invention took place. From about 1900 on, all big American companies had their own in-house R&D, whether it was Westinghouse, General Electric, Esso at the time, Union Oil, General Motors, all had big corporate Kodak, big corporate R&D labs. And today's, yes, there's still some of the corporate R&D labs. We managed to blow up the best of them, which was Bell Labs. When I say blow it up, that was part of the AT&T divestiture with a clumsy hand of the government. Bell Labs, which was probably the greatest research organization that Western civilization has ever enjoyed, was collateral damage to antitrust zealots. I'm not saying the breakup wasn't a good idea. It's just because they have paid no attention to innovation. The fact that they managed to skittle the greatest research lab in the world doesn't seem to matter to them. Organization, the lifetime employment model of the old economy model is gone. Defined benefit plans are gone. Today, it's much more the gig economy, insecure employment. I mean, IBM had to break IBM used to pride itself on its lifetime employment model, like the Japanese, no longer so. And even in Japan, lifetime employment is a little bit frayed at the edges. And then big differences with respect to finance too. In the old economy model, venture finance was from personal savings. It was family money. It was the Gettys. It was the Rockefellers. It was Rothschilds. In today's world, it's organized venture capital, of course, and pension funds that have provided money for that. So it's institutionalized. And that transformation took place, beginning in the 1960s. The first ever venture fund, as far as I know, was Venrock. Ven for venture, Rock for Rockefeller. It was the Rockefeller family money. So these are very, very large institutional changes that have changed the nature of the economy, changed the nature of competition, and changed how firms compete. But unless you understand this, when you look out there, there are many, many vestiges of the old economy all over the place. It's still not gone. It's still there. Less so in Silicon Valley, of course, but much of the rest of America and in Europe, for sure, in Japan, the old economy model is still alive. It's on life support in many cases. I mean, Europe has tens of thousands of so-called zombie firms. I don't know if you've heard that term, zombie firms, which are firms that are essentially on life support from banks or from governments. The new economy model is where, of course, dynamic capabilities is necessary to compete. In the old economy model, you could get by with ordinary capabilities. And here is Lazonic again looking at the structure of the business enterprise. And whereas, you used to have just US-based operations before. Now, of course, everything is global, that you access a global marketplace, you access global labor force, even though people are not fully mobile, services are. I mean, one of the startup companies I'm working with, the CEO's secretary sits in the Ukraine. She schedules everything for him and schedules all the corporate meetings. She'll work through the night, through her night if she has to. And, I think he's paying about 1/10 the price for his executive assistant by going to the Ukraine. But particularly in COVID, where we don't pay any attention to routines, it's working quite well, and certainly inexpensively. So we have very, very different business organization, a very, very different competitive landscape, a very, very different institutional structure. And if you're not alert to that, you're going to bumble along thinking that the world is as it was yesterday. I'm trying to find a place to stop for questions. I think this is what did I do here? Oops. Why don't I stop right here, because I want to go on to talk about the role of intangible assets in a systematic way. So what I've covered is an overview of dynamic capabilities and the next generation competition. The reason we need dynamic capabilities, the reason we need to throw away the Michael Porter textbook is it was about the old economy. That's long gone in most of America and in many parts of the world. Didn't exist in China because they got to build things again afresh. Well, no, there's elements of the old economy in China too, of course, with steel and cement and so forth. So the world is, to be honest, transitioning from the old structure to the new. Ordinary capabilities will carry the day in a few places, but not in the post-2000 knowledge economy. So Ian, let's stop here and see if we have some questions.
So we have a few in the chat, and we can go through those first. And Professor Teece, you should be able to see the first one from.
Yeah, I don't know
Dan
much about gaming. Okay, here he is. Do you think Amazon's diversification strategy an example of coherent diversification? Yes, and let me tell you why. First of all, it started in books, and a lot of people were saying, well, maybe this will work for books, but it's very different if you're selling food or if you're selling furniture. I think that Amazon has figured out how to sell many other products, including food and furniture. But there's certain things it is really having trouble with too, which is, like auto parts and things like that. There's no way that you can get the detail and highly configured auto parts that you need over Amazon. So they're stuck, and they're not. I don't know if they've tried. I mean, they haven't, like medical supplies, dental supplies. It's not. I'm sure they're thinking about these things, and they're working primarily where they can use customer data, and different levels in the industry, selling to wholesalers and whatever. They're not really doing that yet. So their online sales, to me, have been fairly coherent. And then, of course, you've got AWS. And AWS is coherent too, because as I understand it, what Amazon discovered early on was that they needed server capacity to meet peak demand, which was, Christmas shopping, and that there was an alternative use for all this server capacity. And so they figured out that, and this is a very Penrosian idea. You will find in the reading list various references to a British economist called Edith Penrose, who wrote in the 50s about diversification, and she said that diversification is driven by the use of excess resources, and that when it is, and those excess resources can be managerial talent, or it can be excess capacity in the company. And when it is excess capacity in the company, it's a form of good diversification. She didn't use those terms, but that's essentially what Edith Penrose said. And so in my mind, AWS is very much a Penrosian diversification. So yeah, quick off the top of the head, I think Amazon is being very coherent and lateral. It doesn't look, when you look at AWS, it doesn't look, it looks like it's a completely different end market. After all, it's computing services. But when you look underneath the hood, it's computing services or server capacity that was spare that they put to alternative use. So at a blunt level, I think it is coherent. And then there's a comment here, Amazon Pharmacy is a thing now. I haven't used it myself, and yeah, I know you can buy, I bought a bottle of Advil. I don't know if it's a fully stocked pharmacy, but certainly there are some pharmaceutical products, but I don't know where it's going to end. So they're all good questions. The question up here about the taco phone, I don't know what that is. If my company wants to buy assets from another company, what should be the thought process according to dynamic capabilities? Well, it says, are those assets ones that can strengthen your competitive advantage? Does it augment your capabilities? Does it help you? Is it a VRIN asset? Is it a valuable asset? Is it difficult to replicate? And can it be easily integrated into the company? And of course, what's the price for it? So what dynamic capabilities does is course you. The beginning proposition should be no, because you build things from the inside, you build it yourself. But sometimes, if to get a strategic foothold, you might want to buy. But if you do buy, then it has to be consistent with your strategy, and it has to either build a capability that you need for other things or leverage existing capabilities. So there are a set of sort of requirements that it be close into what you're doing, kind of thing. Dynamic capabilities is not, unless you're Kodak on your last legs. Even if you're Kodak on your last legs, what you do is you look for other ways to use your technology, and like in the case of the Japanese company that went off into pharmaceutical products. Be cautious about diversification. Did I catch everything, Ian?
In the chat so far, yes. Other questions?
And I'll take an audio question too, if there's one that can't be put down in succinctly. But okay, so will be 3 or 4 more windows and times for chat. So for questions. So let's move on. I now want to talk about intangible assets. Some of you may be aware, in 2000, I published a book called Managing Intellectual Capital. So in parallel, while I've been developing the dynamic capabilities framework, I have been beating the drum that the most important assets that managers need to worry about are not the ones on the balance sheet, but they're the ones that are not on the balance sheet that you can't necessarily see and measure, and they're intangibles. And intangibles can be, know-how. It can be relationships. They can be understandings. They can be knowledge, just knowledge itself, or know-how is knowledge. And intangibles should be distinguished from intellectual property and from physical assets. So let's just talk about this a little bit. So the first thing I want to focus on is not the intellectual property question, but the difference between physical assets and intangible assets. The first one is that intangibles, the great thing about intangible assets is they can be used over and over again, and they don't necessarily wear out. They may get better. Whereas a physical asset, once you consume it, it's all gone. So an ice cream is a physical asset. Well, not an asset, it's a physical commodity. Once you've eaten it, if Ian eats the ice cream, I can't eat it. Whereas if it's Newton's third law, if I use Newton's third law, Ian can use Newton's third law, and it doesn't wear out. So there's this, what economists call rivalry in use. that there's no rivalry in use with respect to intangibles. They can be used over and over again. Although you have to be careful. If it's something like a reputation, yes, it can be used over and over again, but you don't want to abuse it. You abuse a reputation once and it's gone. So reputations are a form of intangible. Relationships are a form of intangible. Of course, the primary example in the business world of intangible assets is technological know-how. Certainly not the only example. I mean, relationship capital is just as valuable, but people understand that technological know-how and trade secrets are intangible assets. So the problem and the challenge from a management point of view is it's much harder to manage and to own intangible assets. So I've got that second item there, second column, second row, called property rights. And I say intangible assets, property rights are narrow and fuzzy, physical assets are broad and relatively clear. So let's just take a physical asset. If you own a car, it's yours. It's got a registration number. If I steal it, you got a reasonably good chance of getting it back. Closer to the Mexican or Canadian border, or closer to the Mexican border, probably you lose it, the less chance it has to come back. Because if it's on the other side of the border, it's harder to get it back. But if I own a home, despite the advertisements on TV which say, be careful, someone's going to steal your property rights overnight, so you should buy my insurance product here. I think it's unlikely that someone's going to steal your property rights. You have to clearly give them away or sell them before you lose them, at least in most Western countries. So property rights, and think about, if you own a house, think about the land. You know where the boundaries are. You know precisely where the boundaries are, or more or less precisely. In the Berkeley Hills, sometimes because of movement, I think with my neighbor, the boundary line has moved an inch. Well, the boundary line hasn't moved an inch, but the property has moved an inch or something like that. I don't know which one it is, but it's relatively clear. Whereas for intellectual property, let's just take a patent. What are the boundaries of a patent? Well, there's certain what are called claims in a patent, and they're often a bit vague. So one way to think about intellectual property is to say that it's characterized by fuzzy boundaries. And in fact, the reason why there's disputes around patent infringement is sometimes because it's not clear where the boundaries of the patent are. And so what happens is there'll be a court fight, and let's suppose I got 20 claims on my patent that say if you do this, and this, or do any of the above, then you're violating my patent. The court may say, well, claims 1 through 15 are valid, but claims 15 through 20 are not. And so sometimes, in fact, very often, a patent needs to be so-called tested in court in order for there to be clarity with respect to the boundaries of the patent. When you read a patent, it's a description of intellectual property, but the boundaries are kind of like, well, the analogy to land would be take 20 paces to the right, walk in the direction of the sun for another 35 paces, and then over to the oak tree, and then back home. That's sort of the level of crispness in a patent compared to physical property rights. And as a consequence, there we have the third row, which is measurement and valuation. It's difficult with respect to intangibles. And that's why the accounting profession doesn't want to touch intangibles, not because they're unimportant, but because they're difficult to measure. whereas measuring a physical asset, counting the number of cars in the garage and the make and model is not all that hard. Needless to say, the tighter the boundaries, the easier it is to sell something. If it's very clear what I'm selling, in other words, if my property rights are well defined, then you can have a market. I know what I'm buying and you know what you're selling. If the property rights are vague, I don't know quite what I'm buying and you don't know quite what you're selling. So it can sometimes be close to a pig in a poke. So tradability is low. And you immediately, hopefully, can see here that the market for know-how works better if there are stronger property rights, or at least clearer property rights. And that gets down to, is this recognized on balance sheets or not? And the answer is no. The only thing that goes on balance sheets is this concept called goodwill. If you buy a company for more than its book value, you call that goodwill. Archaic 100-year-old concept, which is nonsensical, but it's what accountants do and what we all accept. And yet physical assets, down to the last screwdriver, are often found on a balance sheet. And the strategic value, I would say, in the industrial world, physical assets were valuable, but in the knowledge economy, they're way less valuable. The greatest value comes from intangibles. So the world is upside down. But most people haven't recognized it. When I say most people, accountants haven't, because the accounting standards haven't changed to reflect this reality. Maybe they never will, because we have to be precise. And if you put precision as the most important criteria, then you're never going to include intangibles. So we're beginning to get some insights into the management challenge of the new economy, or next generation competition, where the name of the game is about building, managing, and leveraging intangibles, whereas the game that Henry Ford played was about physical assets and managing physical property and producing physical items. So that's the reason why we need dynamic capabilities, is because we need a framework that wrestles with intangible assets. And capabilities, of course, are an intangible asset. People always say to me, well, tell me exactly what the capabilities are and where are they, and what are the dimensions of them and how much are they worth? I don't know the answers to those always. I can give you a general description, but instead of walking away saying it's irrelevant, you have to stop and say, well, gee, that is the most important question. Now let me think about it and let me at least get a qualitative understanding of it. So this is, I'm just taking some tables out of the reading list. And all of this is in the reading list. You don't have to, I'm sure you recognize this because you probably already read it. But I like to distinguish between what I call appropriability regimes. This is an important concept. This kind of midterm question you may get from me. What is an appropriability regime? This is a term of art that I've coined, and it's sort of caught on out there in the literature. And there's two dimensions to it. One's the intellectual property right. Is it strong, or is it loose, or is it tight? And the other one is the inherent potential for imitation. Is it weak, or is it high, or is it low? And that leads to defining, three different appropriability regimes. Strong, where you've got inherently difficult to imitate. Something is inherently difficult to imitate, and you got strong patent protection. And weak is where you've got you don't have IP protection and it's easy to imitate. And then moderate is the other two cases. And so actually maybe this is a great place to pause and ask for examples from you of different appropriability regimes around different products. You know, think about products that you're familiar with and the appropriability regime associated with them. So maybe, yeah, let's just pause right now, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to either ask a question or to give an example from a circumstance that you're familiar with. So let me give you an example from history. When the Boeing developed the 707, and this was in the time of Mao was in charge of China, the Chinese decided they wanted to make the 707 too. So they bought a 707 and they completely stripped it down to all the components, and they went off and copied all those components and put it back together. And needless to say, the plane didn't even get off the runway. So there's some, I would say, forgetting about the intellectual property protection, there's some inherent imitability issues there. Just replicating the pieces doesn't necessarily get you the integrity of the whole. So that would be a case of, you know, actually an airplane is not as imitable. If you've got all the plans, then maybe it is. And if you got all the technology associated with manufacturing it, which of course is why there's been enormous cyber theft of U.S. military secrets. You know, the rest of the world has gotten a lot of our advanced fighter jets and so forth because of hacking. Because, you know, most of it's codified these days, but not all of it's codified. And so with hacking, you don't necessarily get the uncodified or the tacit piece. But some products are, the ease of imitability is also a function of whether the product's sold in the marketplace. If it's sold in the marketplace, if it's not sold in the marketplace, you keep your secrets in the manufacturing process, it's somewhat easy to protect. So let's see if we have any questions, Ian, before we move on.
I had a quick question here, and just to sort of build on what you said. Yes, sorry. Hi, my name's Kopal Sinha. I'm an engineer right now with an ad tech company, and I'm just, we're a small firm, so I'm just trying to figure out whether this is a good place to be and how well we're positioned for our go-to-public strategy, and just see if there's anything else that we need to be doing. I guess my question right now is to sort of build on the example that you gave, but like not with something as complicated as an airplane, but something like a phone. So I feel like in the appropriability regimes, I'm wondering if the geopolitical scene like also plays a factor into this, because I'm from India, so I can like, there are a lot of cheap knockoffs of iPhones that are just more affordable, and because it's not, as regulated, like that flies in India, but it does not necessarily fly here. So I'm wondering if there needs to be almost like a third dimension on this about which market are you playing in.
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. Intellectual property rights is not, is jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So I didn't mean to imply there's just one jurisdiction, but you're absolutely right. The difference between the United States, between the EU, are relatively small, but with China, it's significantly different. I mean, I remember when I was first visiting China, they didn't really have any patent laws or IP laws at all, but they had brought in IP rights. And some people claim it's actually easier to get an injunction in China than in some other places, and that may be true. But damages you really can't get significant damages in China. And if it's something that's important to the state, you don't get any redress whatsoever. So that's China. Brazil, if it's pharmaceutical products, you have no chance of getting, well, it used to be the case, you had almost no chance of getting intellectual property rights support. India, well, you know the answer better than I. But there is, rule of law, and there are IP rights in India, and there are cell phone IP right battles going on in India today. I'm aware of that. But you're right, that IP rights are jurisdiction by jurisdiction, which means it's not necessarily country by country, because a jurisdiction may not be country specific. The EU is pretty much, the EU is one jurisdiction. UK is now going to be a separate jurisdiction. And China has been very, the WTO did not really imagine all the different ways in which companies and individuals can work around intellectual property rights. So the movie industry and so forth claims that there's still enormous copying going on there, illegal copying, but in the technology space, very hard to get protection in China. Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Right. There are actually two in the chat.
Okay.
The last two.
What about internally developed software? Is this not sufficient to capture intangible value? Well, the good news about, let's just talk in general about software. Software is protected by copyright in the United States. Some other countries is not, and that is, if it's software that you're selling externally, then you get protection from copyright. If it's just software you develop in-house and you don't sell, you not only get copyright protection, but you've also got trade secret protection. So you have two types of intellectual property protection working for you. But the minute you put it out there, while you have copyright protection, you have to enforce your copyrights. It's not compliance. Is not automatic. So, or in the case of copyright, it's misuse. So you talk about intellectual property misappropriation, you talk about misuse or infringement. So with patents, you can get infringement. With trade secrets, you can get misappropriation and misuse. And all of these are legal causes of action. And in the United States, you can get damages for that. And, there is often a bit of to and fro. The pendulum tends to swing back and forth a little bit around patent protection. It used to be in the 60s that it was big companies that were in favor of patents and strong IP protection because they had the IP. Today, it's small companies that frequently have got the best and the strongest and the most protected IP. And so the big companies are suddenly not as forcefully defending intellectual property as they used to be. So the champions of the IP system today are frequently small companies that don't have any other way of don't have a good way, don't have the complementary assets that are needed to fully commercialize the technology, and so they're looking to IP protection to give them some return on their investment. I think Fitbit and GoPro both represent strong brands initially, but underlying tech was weak in their appropriability. That could well be right. So you're working towards this, my profiting from innovation framework, which says the complementary assets. Given the profiting from innovation framework, which we're going to get to, says because because you generally can't rely on IP, except in the pharmaceutical industry where you can patent a particular molecule, IP is always problematic as a way to defend your knowledge. So you have to think about complements and complementary assets. And building a brand, if you can build a brand around something, if you build a brand that, and even if someone copies your intellectual property, the brand is protectable through trademarks, and you can at least have trademarks working for you. So trademark is a form of intellectual property. You got trademarks, you got trade secrets, you got copyright, you got patents. They're the four key legs of the intellectual property system in most countries. And yes, brands can help, and that's where sometimes being first does help. If being the first mover, you can develop a brand, and even if you get knocked off, you still got one leg to stand on. Okay, let's move on.
No, actually, one question, or let's see. So I have one, unless anyone else has a question at this point. All right. So let's see, something like, well, the Amazon shopping cart, which would have inherent potential for imitation, presumably high. However, it was in litigation for years, whether that could be a patented concept or not. Can you comment on something like that, where in theory it could be imitated, perhaps not exactly, but close enough, and yet it has perhaps undefined intellectual property rights subject to ongoing court challenges?
Can you remind me whether it was patented or was it the copyright? I mean, what was Amazon claiming? Violation of trademark or of patents?
Right, and so no, I'm actually not sure if it was Amazon itself as much as another company with a similar application, but it was claiming a patent from having effectively a unique method, that the method would be that a user would go through the motions of this shopping cart app.
Well, probably not. If it, the criteria for a patent is it has to be novel, and it has to be useful, and it has to not be known to someone generally familiar with the trade. So, I doubt that it would be patentable or would survive a challenge on patent validity. But let me take that one up and in a break or do a little research on it and get you a better answer. What time is our break normally set for, Ian?
7:30, so we've got about 10 more minutes.
Okay, so let's go back and go on with some more slides here. This is, I assigned you that article by Milbison, and this is providing just a little bit more detail. This was Morgan Stanley, yes. It's a Morgan Stanley report, which, by the way, I just got this recently, and the fact it's taken 25, 30 years, investors are starting to wake up to the fact that intangible assets really matter for asset values. How we can have so many smart people on Wall Street and it takes them so long to get to these points. I don't know, I guess you tell me, if I'm so smart, why aren't I richer than all of them? And it's a good question. I won't give you the answer. But anyway, here are some categories that this very useful Morgan Stanley paper comes up with. Computerized information, innovative property, economic competences. So they didn't quite get to capabilities. And the reason they didn't is because, well, yeah, there is intellectual property protection on some element of capabilities. If it's a trade secret, if there's a piece of technology that's supporting the way the company makes decisions, maybe it can be supported by intellectual property, but generally that's not the case. But anyway, this little exhibit, points out that computerized information has generally got copyright protection. Maybe it also has trademark protection. What they call innovative property, which is from R&D, they've got up there that you get patents or you get designs. They miss the fact, all of you folks by the end of this class can do better than these guys at Morgan Stanley. You would put trade secrets up there too. There's one of the main forms of protecting of technological development is trade secrets. Way more important than design rights. Mineral explanation, they got patents up there. They forgot trade secrets again. Trade secrets are very valuable and relatively easy to protect. So long as you keep them as a secret, a court will protect them. If you don't keep them as a secret, if you don't go to, if you don't put the right protocols around, making sure that people check in. Have you ever wondered why they want to get your name and so forth? You do all that complicated check-in when you go visit a company. It's not just because they want to know who you are. It's because they want to prove to a court that they're being diligent about protecting their trade secrets. Because remember, Steve Jobs walked right in by invitation to Xerox PARC and saw everything associated with what subsequently became the Macintosh. He saw the laser printer, he saw the mouse, he saw the Ethernet, and people were very eager and proud to tell him all the technical things and the nature of the inventions behind that. And that blew Xerox's trade secrets, because you got to treat it like a secret yourself. If you don't treat it like a secret yourself, you have no chance of persuading a court that it's a secret. So what they should have done, if they were going to get Steve Jobs, going to give him a look, is make him sign a non-disclosure agreement. They didn't. So the first and most obvious step that you do, they didn't do. And, at that point, I think the engineers and the computer scientists at Xerox PARC were so fed up with Xerox that they probably didn't care. They were quite happy to see the technology go somewhere else so long as it was going to be used. So this Morgan Stanley document talks about innovative property, about designs and other product development costs. And they recognize, yes, designs you can protect by copyright. Economic competences, you can build them through training and skills. I didn't look at this diagram, this table very carefully. It's about as good as an undergraduate at Berkeley could do, but a graduate at Berkeley could do much better. So we'll tidy this up for you, or you can tidy it up for me if you want. But nevertheless, it's intriguing because it shows people on Wall Street starting in their own bumbling way to look at these questions as well. And this is, the rest of the paper is pretty good, so don't get me wrong. I'm just being a little nitpicky here. And some of the data that I've assembled is actually pretty interesting, because it shows, and I haven't quite fully dug into how they're measuring this yet, the rise of intangible investments. And as you see, from 1977, through to 2017, by their metrics, intangibles have eclipsed tangibles. I find that is no surprise. And you see it happens around 2000. But ask yourself, do all the textbooks in the MBA programs read as if intangible assets are more important than tangible? I think the answer is no. If you ask in Silicon Valley, does business strategy focus more on intangibles than tangibles? Definitely yes. In the heartland of America, in Detroit, is it the language of tangibles or intangibles that dominates? I suspect it's tangibles. although that's changing fairly rapidly. But anyway, the point is that if you're not familiar with intangible assets, you can't speak the language of intangibles, and more importantly, think the thoughts of intangibles, you're not playing in the right game. So I thought I'd put this up there because they do a good job of actually summarizing in 3 paragraphs what this means for investors. You could, of course, each one of you write this in terms of implications for managers, but let's just dwell on this for a minute and let's read these 3 paragraphs because I think they're quite interesting. The primary task of an investor is to anticipate revisions in expectations. That's true. I mean, just take last week, Apple announced the best quarter ever with sales and profits higher than every analyst, well, than certainly the median analyst in Wall Street projected, and the price went down. Why? Because at the same time in the press release or in the earnings call, Tim Cook gave some less extravagant predictions about future sales. So even though they had the best quarter, it beat what everyone predicted. He guided expectations for the future down. So stock price went down after announcing the best quarter ever in the history of Apple, the best quarter ever in the history of any firm anywhere on the planet Earth. So that's what you get for beating the numbers. Maupassant goes on to say, this requires an understanding of price-implied expectations and having a sound thesis for why the market will revise those expectations. The primary purpose of financial accounting is to provide a company's external parties, including current and prospective shareholders and creditors, with the information they need to make informed economic decisions. Earnings are deemed to be the single most important output of financial reporting. It used to be that earnings were on the income statement and investments were recorded mostly on the balance sheet. The rise of intangible investment means that the bottom line is now a mix of earnings and investments. The goal of this report is to allow an investor to untangle these pieces and assess them properly. Earnings are less relevant for value today than in the past. By the way, this is bad news for Warren Buffett. You know, if you're a Warren Buffett fan, you know, I'm not sure Warren has got all of this under his belt. So this is because of the rise of intangibles and the increase in non-recurring or ancillary items reported in earnings. We focus on the former, but investors seeking to understand value must thoughtfully deal with both. But here's the problem. They say that the balance sheet is more important than the income statement. But wouldn't that be true if intangibles were actually on the balance sheet, but other than goodwill, they're not? So I leave you to think over the break about this, over the 15-minute break we're about to have about this conundrum. What do they mean here? If the balance sheet is more important, are they thinking about some imaginary balance sheet in the sky that you and I can create once we understand intangibles? Or are they thinking about something different? Anyway, the point here is that earnings are less important. Cash flow, though, I think if you say earnings are less important, what is more important? I mean, maybe it's just cash flow, and earnings are not necessarily the same as cash flow. So we'll leave you with those things to think about. And when we come back, Ian, we will pick up on this. But it's time, it's 7:30 now, so we're going to have the 15-minute break. We'll begin again at 7:45. Without promising to answer all your questions, I will take a look at the chat. and see what we can do.